air-bursting fragmentation shockwave of happiness. Ignores cover saves. Ignores grumpy saves. That's right. People are deflecting my happiness with their crabbiness shields. All right, folks, we're going to be talking today about something near and dear to my heart, and that is the narrative placement of terrain. And quite frankly, it irritates me to no end to see horribly placed non-narrative terrain. You know, like you'll see this setup, and you know, people will just be like, well, let's put some of that. Let's go, oh, this is kind of cool. Let's get this medieval village piece on here. You know, let's put that on the roof. I'm like, come on, people, make it narrative. Like, why would they build this village with these two giant pillar things, like right in the middle? It makes absolutely no sense. So, okay, so enough of the downside. Let's talk about how to do it. Yes, I'm an expert on this for some reason all of a sudden. Okay, so for example, this table, you've got to look at, so what's the story here? It's that there's a small village in a canyon, and maybe this is like a trade route that comes through, and that would make a great scene for a battle, that somehow this is like some critical element, or maybe they're looking for an individual that's like hiding in this little mountain pass village thing. So I've taken a set, reinvented it with some other pieces. Things that are off here, though, obviously are the like these little undead Warhammer Necromancer stuff pieces, which you can see on over here as well. You can see this. So, like, why are those there? But that actually does make a little sense. Maybe this village, that's where they inter their dead. That's kind of the cliff faces are kind of like the city cemetery. So I actually found it to be quite evocative. Now, the other thing to look at, other than things making sense, and we'll get more into that in just a little bit, is you got to look at the actual placement of the pieces, or what's called density. So, and it has to be appropriate for the game that you're playing. So this particular terrain set is appropriate for Warhammer 40K. Well, the density of it at least, because it's got enough room for like tanks to go through. And plenty of places for there to be cover. There are some problems, though, on how I've laid this out. I.e., if you look over here, there's this giant lane of fire. So you have to consider that there's like tactical areas as well. In a way, you're pre-shaping how the game is going to go by setting up the terrain in a certain way. So by leaving this open over here, I've made obviously a very kind of almost a killing field. Now, in terms of density, so for infinity, this would not be nearly dense enough. You would need to add at least 5 times this amount of terrain, right, guys? Like, it would have to be like really packed. Otherwise, everything would just be this wretched killing field. A game of infinity would last like 1.5 turns on this board. Everyone would just die from well-placed headshots in like 5 seconds. So, but for Warhammer Fantasy, this would actually be terrible because it would be so dense you couldn't like actually maneuver your guys around. So you got to watch your density. So, for example, if I were going to modify this, I might go ahead and just add another piece here to make this not such a killing field. But what if I did something like this? What if I connected these two? Well, that obviously, like I call it constipation. If you constipate a section of the board, it means you're pinching it off so you can't get your troops through. So if this were Warhammer Fantasy, for example, and the deployment zones were long edge, and I think that's pretty much how they do it still, and I placed 2 giant pieces like this, that would be rightly called a constipated area, because my opponent would have to like somehow get his troops through these narrow defiles, and that basically makes for not a fun game. Another thing to consider is the actual armies that you're using. So, for example, if your opponent is a horde close combat army, you don't want to be that guy and create a board that is, say, overly open. so that it becomes a shooting gallery. You know, you don't want to make a Gallipoli there. My apologies to the Portuguese. I don't know what I'm talking about. So anyway, about that. I do know what I'm talking about when it comes to narrative terrain. Yeah, these guys are like, Sean, don't announce that you don't know what you're talking about halfway through the video. At least do it at the beginning so people are warned ahead of time.
Just to be clear, the Gallipoli campaign, also known just as Gallipoli, was a 9-month battle that happened during World War I between Britain, France, and the Ottoman Empire. The Gallipoli campaign was a major defeat for the Allies and an incredible victory for the Ottoman Empire. April 25th, known as Anzac Day, is also associated with the Gallipoli campaign, and Anzac Day marks the birth of national consciousness for Australia and New Zealand. It's also celebrated in those two countries, along with Armistice Day, as a major day of remembrance. Gallipoli was also popularized in the United States by the 1981 film starring Mel Gibson and Mark Lee. It features an Australian unit charging across open ground towards the Turkish lines and being cut down mercilessly by machine gun fire. Thus, Sean's reference. And that's History with Mike.
Okay, so you do have to be, if you're the one setting up the train, you do need to be considerate. Now, an obvious flaw of this terrain is that I've made these huge open areas where you could actually place guys on here. So I'm playing Tau, and they've got jet bikes and grav tanks and all sorts of things that can just navigate this really easy, plus lots of long-range weaponry. So depending on who my opponent is, these pieces might be completely inappropriate for the game. And you can solve that in two ways. One, you can actually just get rid of them entirely. Or you can make them at the beginning of the game when your opponent shows up. You just be like, these are just bookends for decoration. So this is the edge of the board, basically. And you can constrict the board. I call pieces like this bookends, obviously. But I've also been experimenting in terrain with, so this is for you terrain makers, with the idea of having something at the ends of the board that are very tall. And in fact, I've wanted to, as time goes on, I've wanted to make boards that were so big that the terrain pieces at the sides were actually taller than the participants. And I think that would almost like force perspective or have like a mental effect to really feel like you were in the game world. So there's something to be said by putting some decorative pieces on the end. And those can actually be very small. So for example, I might say, all right, those are inappropriate. So I'll go ahead and grab just these, you know, these little things here. And I'll just put a trio of them in a sort of a natural fashion, you know, a 1, 2, 3. And it's like I'm interior decorating a table. So anyway, I don't think it'll cross over very well. I don't think there's a career for me there. So anyway, but just a little something like this can just add a feel to a table. Now, let's get in a little bit closer here. So what's the narrative here? I put these generators on. Well, why does this little village have these technological marvels? Are they, you know, water vapor condensers? Is this like a power station in the middle of this pass where power gets like from one major city center to another? What is there a dam nearby that generates this stuff? And these are just actually not dwellings, but they're actually like little utility rooms. And so you've really got to create a little bit of a story with it. So, you know, I put these little shanties out here where maybe they just have, you know, little bits of equipment that they're just storing there temporarily. Like these. Why are these crates on the roof? How do they even get on the roof? So these crates being here are nice because they provide some cover. And in fact, if I had my way, and I do, I would actually put more on the roofs, because what I found is playing this board, you end up with hover tanks get up here and dislodge guys. Some of them are in the deployment zone, so they have guys on top. And it's fun to put something on this sort of second layer of play. The great thing about this board is it has a third layer, which is these roofs come off, and obviously there's this area inside. Now, if you're going to be hyper realistic, you want to populate this with tables and chairs and stuff. But of course we don't, because it would be really not very playable. So we just call it difficult terrain because we assume there's civilians and stuff in there. But the guys that made this terrain, incidentally the camera people here, really did a good job, because they created these little interior walls, which I think really adds to it, and also prevents line of sight from going all the way through the building in every single case. And by the way, that is a very interesting feature of this board, because smart players who actually get down to that level will actually be able to snipe your tank with a laser cannon shooting through the windows. I've had that happen a couple of times, or rather I've done that to somebody a couple of times. So and I put on these little sandbags and whatnot, and it really adds. So folks, that is my very basic view of narrative terrain. And I think, of course, if you pay attention to your terrain and really think about the story inside the game, it'll add a lot to your games. It will be, and also be more of an interesting and fair setup. So thanks for tuning in, and I hope you got your inspiration for the day.